The first thing the 340 Marines heard was not the impact. It was the laughter. It rolled across the training bay in a low, easy wave, bounced off cinder block walls, and flattened itself under the steel rafters like it belonged there. Boots shifted on concrete. Palms slapped against sleeves. Someone in the back muttered the kind of line men repeat when they think the ending is already decided. "Careful," Staff Sergeant Michael Callahan said, grinning as he circled his opponent on the mat. "She bites." More laughter. Not loud this time. Sharper. Meaner. In front of him stood Sergeant Emily Carter, 5'4" in utility trousers and a sweat-darkened tan shirt, hands open at chest height, chin tucked, eyes flat and unreadable. She was smaller by almost 50 pounds. He had reach, rank over most of the room, and the confidence of a man who had spent too many months being rewarded for mistaking volume for authority. It was supposed to be a demonstration, a little humiliation dressed up as training, a reminder of who could joke and who had a smile through it. Callahan had run plenty of these sessions before. Marine Corps martial arts program blocks, drills, correctional handling, control techniques, all of it performed with the theater that comes naturally to an audience in uniform. You teach a lesson, tell a story, make somebody sweat, make everybody remember. That part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was Carter, because she had already been turned into a story before she ever stepped onto the mat. For months, she had been the easy punchline. Too quiet, too tense, too proud, too sensitive, too hard to read. Somewhere along the line, a rumor had attached itself to her like barbed wire to fabric. That she snapped at people, that she was unstable, that she had issues, that she had gone after someone, that if you got too close, she'd take your hand off. None of it had ever been said cleanly. Nothing direct enough to answer. Nothing solid enough to file. Just fragments. Smirks. Side comments. The 1,000 small cuts of a command climate that wanted entertainment more than truth. And now all of it had narrowed to a rectangle of green mat under fluorescent lights. Callahan bounced once on the balls of his feet. Performance energy. The kind men use when they think an audience is on their side. "Come on, Sergeant," he said. "Show them what you got." Carter said nothing. That was another thing they laughed at. Her silence. People who don't understand discipline always confuse it with weakness. The base smelled like canvas, floor cleaner, and old sweat cooked in a gear. Outside, through the high windows, late afternoon light bled orange through the Carolina haze. Inside, the room had that pressurized stillness common to military spaces just before something stupid happens. Even the Marines at the back, the ones who had come expecting nothing more than another block of instruction to survive before chow, could feel the air changing. Callahan reached for her once, almost lazily, the way a bigger man tests a smaller one in public. He wanted a flinch, a stumble. He wanted her to react too early so he could turn it into another line, another laugh, another memory that would keep her in the place he had assigned her. She didn't move. Not really. Just a fraction of a shift in weight. Barely visible. What nobody in that room understood yet was that Emily Carter had been standing inside worse pressure than this for a very long time. Humiliation was not new. Fear was not new. Being watched by men who thought they knew her story was not new. The new part was this. For the first time, she had decided to stop giving them extra room. Callahan came in again, faster now, hand extending toward her shoulder in a mock-aggressive collar tie. Not enough to injure, just enough to dominate the frame. The room tightened. Somebody whistled. He was smiling when he moved, smiling when he planted his foot, smiling when he committed his weight forward. And then the smile vanished. Carter slipped off the line so cleanly it looked like the mat had shifted under him. Her left foot pivoted, her hips turned, and his reaching arm became a handle. There was no wasted motion, no dramatic wind-up, no movie flourish. Just timing, balance, leverage. The oldest physics in the world, applied by someone who knew exactly where his center was and where it would fail. One heartbeat, he was upright. The next, the entire room was staring at the soles of his boots. The sound of him hitting the mat was enormous. A hard, flat concussion of weight and surprise. Not because it was violent, because it was final. 340 Marines saw Staff Sergeant Michael Callahan on his back, breath blasted out of him, eyes wide with the stunned disbelief of a man encountering reality half a second too late. Carter stayed standing. She had not overcommit. She had not lost her balance. She had not even looked angry. She took one small step back, reset her stance, and waited for instructions that never came. The laughter was gone, every last trace of it. What remained was worse for him and far more dangerous for everyone else. Silence. It spread in concentric rings from the mat outward, swallowing the room. Marines who had been smirking a second earlier went expressionless. Junior NCOs stared without blinking. One corporal near the wall actually looked over his shoulder, as if trying to figure out whether he had somehow entered the wrong version of the afternoon. Callahan tried to sit up and failed on the first attempt. Not because he was injured badly, because humiliation weighs more than a body ever should. And standing above him, breathing steadily, face composed, was the woman he had spent months reducing to a rumor. But that throw was never the real shock. Not even close. The real shock was what it meant. Because the thing about public cruelty is that it always assumes there's no hidden file, no second story, no witness who stayed quiet for a reason. It assumes the target is simple, weak, explained, harmless to mock. What those 340 Marines did not know, what Callahan absolutely did not know, was that Sergeant Emily Carter had spent months swallowing insult after insult, not because she couldn't fight back, but because she was holding together something far more fragile than her pride. A younger Marine, a buried complaint, a trail of favors and threats that ran straight through the chain of command. And by the time Callahan's back hit that mat, the joke had already died. What was about to rise in its place was the kind of truth that destroys careers. If you're still here, stay with me, because this story does not end on that mat. And tell me where you're watching from, because what happened next turned one humiliating demonstration into the beginning of a reckoning nobody in that building was ready for. 3 months earlier, before the throw, before the silence, before 340 Marines learned how wrong they had been, Carter was the kind of Marine many commands rely on and almost never celebrate. She was early, always early. Her rack was squared away, her paperwork clean, her gear maintained down to the details nobody checked unless something went wrong. She knew which privates were fighting credit card debt, which lance corporals were one bad weekend from NJP, which young Marines had started cutting weight too hard before PFT, and which ones pretended they were fine because they had not yet learned that pretending is not the same as coping. She did not make herself the center of rooms. That, in a healthy command, would have been interpreted correctly, as professionalism, as steadiness, as the mark of someone more interested in doing the job than narrating herself doing it. But there are environments where quiet competence creates irritation, especially in people who live off reaction. Carter did not flatter the right egos. She did not laugh on cue. She did not turn every training evolution into a personality contest. She taught clearly, corrected directly, and expected standards to mean the same thing regardless of who wore them. That made her valuable to some Marines and inconvenient to others. The battalion was in that familiar cycle between field evolutions, inspections, and workups, the kind of stretch where everyone was technically busy and somehow still had enough leftover energy for gossip. Long corridors, humming lights, office doors half open, printers coughing out rosters and counseling sheets, the smell of wet camis after morning PT. Normal on paper. Uneasy in the bones. There was a reason for that unease, though most junior Marines couldn't have named it. The command functioned, but did not breathe well. Orders moved downward. Fear moved sideways. Rumors moved fastest of all. At the center of that climate, though not always visibly, was Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Harlan, the operations chief. Late 40s, immaculate boots, voice like sandpaper over wood. A man who had learned over 2 decades that you can build a private kingdom inside any bureaucracy if you control 3 things: access, timing, and uncertainty. Harlan was the kind of senior Marine who could get a problem fixed in an hour or bury it for 6 months. He knew whose package was waiting on signature, whose leave request needed reconsideration, whose proficiency marks were due, whose school slot might open, whose mistake could be made to disappear, and whose reputation could be shaped by a few well-placed conversations. He rarely yelled in public. Men like that don't have to. They use other people's voices. Callahan was one of those voices. He was younger than Harlan by almost 15 years, broad-shouldered, charismatic in the way that reads as leadership from a distance, and deeply attuned to the social rewards of a crowd. He was a natural demonstrator, a strong physical instructor, quick with a joke, quick with a correction, quick to decide who in a platoon would be treated as a future leader and who would be used as a warning. Marines liked being around him if they were safe around him. If they were not, every day had to be managed. Carter understood men like that immediately, not because she feared them, because she had met them before. She grew up in a town where people measured worth by what you could carry and how little you complained while carrying it. Her father drove trucks. Her mother taught judo twice a week in a church rec hall that smelled like dust and floor wax. Emily had learned how to fall before she learned how to drive, how to keep breathing when pinned, how to wait for the shift in another body that turned defense into opportunity. Nothing glamorous, nothing cinematic, just repetition, patience, mechanics. When she enlisted, some recruiters saw her size first. Some drill instructors saw her endurance next. But the Marines who mattered most in her early career saw what happened under fatigue and pressure. They saw that she kept clarity when others got loud, that she did not fold when isolated, that she could absorb stress without becoming stupid. In a profession that likes visible intensity, those are easy gifts to overlook until the day you suddenly need them. By the time she picked up sergeant, she had already earned a quiet reputation for being the Marine you wanted near confusion. She could teach, document, de-escalate, and, when necessary, put someone on the ground without drama, which is why the younger Marines trusted her. One of them was Lance Corporal Ava Ruiz. Ruiz had arrived 6 weeks before everything cracked open. 19. Sharp eyes. Quick learner. Texas border town, youngest of 4, first in her family to wear the uniform. She still moved with that new Marine combination of discipline and exposed hope. Her boots were always polished a little too carefully. Her sleeves stayed rolled exactly to regulation. She wrote things down. She thanked people twice. She wanted to be good enough, fast enough, that nobody could question whether she belonged. People like Ruiz are easy to spot in any unit. They're the ones predators test first. The first time Carter really noticed her was after morning maintenance, when Ruiz lingered outside the supply cage, pretending to reorganize chem lights that were already organized. Carter had seen that look before. The rehearsed focus. The body trying to remain present while the mind bargains for a safe way to ask for help. "You got something?" Carter asked. Ruiz looked up too fast. "No, Sergeant." Carter nodded once. "All right." She started to leave. "Sergeant." Carter turned back. Ruiz swallowed. If somebody says something that doesn't sound like a threat exactly, but it feels like one, does that count? That was how it began. Not with an explosion. Not with a formal complaint. With a question built like a bridge over deep water. They went for a walk because Carter knew walls have ears and offices make people feel trapped. Out past the motor pool, past a stack of weathered Conex boxes, under a sky that looked white with humidity. Ruiz talked in fragments at first. A hand lingering too long. A closed door that didn't need to close. Comments that would sound harmless if repeated by someone else. Advice given in private. Warnings disguised as mentorship. Who got choice assignments? Who got protected? Who got labeled difficult after they started avoiding certain rooms? No single line was enough on its own. That was the genius of it. A system of pressure built from deniability. Carter did not interrupt. She did not supply meaning Ruiz wasn't ready to say out loud. She listened until the story found its shape. And when it finally did, the name at the center of it was not Callahan. It was Harlan. The real problem was never the loud man in the training bay. It was the quiet one who arranged the room. Harlan had begun with favors. That was his pattern. Admin help. Better shifts. Extra chances after small mistakes. Then came isolation. Private check-ins. Comments about maturity. About loyalty. About how some Marines confused normal mentorship with malicious rumor. When Ruiz started pulling back, the temperature changed. Her requests slowed. Her schedule shifted in petty ways. She got corrected publicly for mistakes others made without consequence. A corporal she trusted stopped speaking to her after a closed-door talk with Harlan. Nobody said it outright, but the message was obvious. The command could become very cold, very fast. Ruiz had not filed anything yet. She was terrified, not of one moment, of the whole machine. Carter knew the machine, too. She knew what restricted reporting meant, what formal channels existed, how chain-of-command loyalty could distort process long before any paperwork reached the right desk. She also knew that once a young Marine's name started moving through gossip before facts, the complaint itself would become secondary to managing her reputation. So Carter made a decision that would cost her more than she guessed. She would protect the Marine first. Not the optics, not the convenience of the command. The Marine. That meant slowing everything down enough to do it right. Documenting dates. Preserving messages. Getting Ruiz to write contemporaneous notes before memory blurred under stress. Contacting the right victim support channel without tipping the wrong people too early. Building a record robust enough to survive men whose first instinct would be to call it misunderstanding. What none of them understood yet was that Harlan was already moving. Predatory men who survive in institutions do not survive by brute force alone. They survive by detecting resistance early. A canceled meeting, a changed tone, a Marine who stops lingering after hours. Another Marine who starts asking procedural questions she did not ask before. That is enough. He did not confront Carter directly. Again, men like that rarely do. Instead, the weather around her changed. She was left off small loops of information. Her recommendations were second-guessed. Extra checks appeared on her work. Tiny frictions multiplied, and then the joke started. At first, they were deniable. A comment about Carter being intense. Another about how some people couldn't take normal interaction. Then the rumor hardened into shape. Someone said she had nearly gone after a Marine in the barracks. Someone else said she had snapped during a field problem. Then came the line that stuck because it was catchy enough to travel. Careful. She bites. Maybe Callahan heard it from Harlan. Maybe from a friend of a friend after Harlan planted the seed somewhere else. Maybe he dressed it up himself because he knew a useful line when he heard one. By the time it reached the platoons, its origin no longer mattered. It had become social fact. And once a lie becomes social fact, many people stop testing it. They perform around it instead. Carter knew exactly what was happening. She also knew that if she challenged every insinuation, every grin, every side comment, two things would happen. First, the rumor would appear confirmed by reaction. Second, and more dangerous, attention would swing toward why she was suddenly so sensitive, and that attention might land on Ruiz before the younger Marine had any control over her own story. So Carter did the hardest thing a strong person can do in a dirty environment. She endured strategically. Every insult swallowed was not surrender. It was time purchased. Every joke unanswered was space preserved for Ruiz to decide, for evidence to accumulate, for the complaint to become stronger than rumor. But endurance has a cost, and the cost is often paid in public. By the second month, even Marines who had no direct hostility toward Carter had adjusted to the new script. They saw Callahan needle her during training and assumed he must know something. They watched her refuse to banter back and took it as proof that she had been put in her place. Some felt bad for her, but only privately. Most did what people do when they sense a command has designated one person as the safe target. They kept their heads down and did the math of self-preservation. That was the disaster. Not one blow, not one order. A whole room learning to stand still while someone is slowly reduced. Callahan enjoyed it more than he should have. That part mattered, because there is a difference between a man participating in a toxic culture and a man drawing energy from it. He started using Carter as a live illustration whenever training slowed. Not always cruel enough to trigger formal correction, just sharp enough to keep her marked. Sergeant Carter, you with us today? Don't crowd her, gentlemen. We all know she gets territorial. Relax, Sergeant. Nobody's stealing your chew toy. The room would laugh. Not everyone. Enough. Carter kept her face neutral. What they didn't know was that nearly every night, After final accountability, she sat at the small metal desk in her room and wrote. Dates, times, witnesses, who said what, where Harlan had been seen, which Marine had gone quiet after a private meeting, which request from Ruiz got delayed, which counseling language looked copied from somewhere else, which rumor appeared immediately after Carter asked a question no one expected her to ask. She built a map. That was her real fight. Not on the mat, on paper, in memory, in patience. Ruiz nearly broke twice. The first time was after a field prep roster changed, and she was moved onto a detail that kept her in proximity to Harlan for most of a Friday afternoon. She came to Carter white-faced and furious at herself for being afraid. He didn't touch me, Ruiz said, voice shaking. He didn't even say anything bad. He just looked at me like he knew I couldn't prove anything. Carter handed her water and made her breathe before answering. That's not nothing, she said. That is pressure. Write it down. The second time was worse. A screenshot surfaced in a group chat. Not explicit, not direct, just a line from an anonymous number sent to Ruiz late at night. Good Marines know who is trying to help them. Don't confuse that. No name, no proof. But the timing matched the day Ruiz had skipped a private mentorship meeting Harlan requested through an intermediary. Ruiz wanted to file immediately then and there, chain of evidence or not. Carter wanted that too. But wanting and surviving are not the same thing. The second you move, Carter told her carefully, you need to be ready for people to act confused, people to suddenly forget things, people to ask why you didn't say it differently, sooner, cleaner, louder. I'm not telling you no. I'm telling you we do this in a way they can't starve. Ruiz cried then, briefly and angrily, wiping her face before the tears could fall properly, embarrassed by them. Carter looked away long enough to give her dignity. That small act would matter later more than either of them knew. Because the thing about restraint is that outsiders usually only notice its surface. They do not see how many times it saves someone else from collapsing. Meanwhile, Callahan's pressure on Carter intensified. Sometimes it was professional. Too professional. A stack of counseling forms returned for tiny wording changes. A requirement to rerun a drill with no clear deficiency. An after-hours check-in that was really an audience for criticism. He never crossed the obvious line. That was what made him effective. He had instinct for inflicting damage while preserving plausible deniability. And still, he had no idea what war he was helping wage. One evening, after a late conditioning block, he caught Carter alone near the gear cage. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Rain hammered the loading dock outside in hard, warm sheets. You got a problem with me, Sergeant? He asked. She kept stacking gloves by size. No, Staff Sergeant. He waited for more. None came. Because people notice attitude, he said. And if you've got something to say, say it. Carter looked at him, then, really looked, and for a moment he mistook calm for concession. I say what needs saying, she replied. It was such a level sentence, so cleanly delivered that he actually smiled. Sure you do. He walked away satisfied, believing he had won. What he never considered was that men who enjoy control often misread composure as submission. They cannot imagine someone choosing not to strike when a strike is possible. That blindness was about to cost him everything he thought he understood. The training demonstration was Harlan's idea before it became Callahan's show. Officially, it was part of a professional development day. Weapons safety refresher in the morning, corrective techniques, ethics brief, martial arts sustainment block in the afternoon. Enough bodies gathered from multiple sections to make the bay feel crowded. Enough rank present to make impression matter. The kind of event where tone gets set not just by the lesson plan, but by who is allowed to become the lesson. Harlan floated the idea casually in a scheduling meeting. Carter should participate, he said. Good for visibility. Good for junior Marines to see female NCOs up front. There was nothing in the proposal itself anyone could object to. Inclusion disguised the trap. Callahan took it from there. He announced pairings day of. No prior notice. No prep discussion. No chance for Carter to decline without looking insubordinate. A classic move if what you want is dominance, disguised as spontaneity. When her name landed opposite his, a few Marines exchanged glances. Not alarm. Expectation. By then, the rumor had trained a room for him, and Carter, standing in line with the others before the block began, understood something with perfect clarity. This was not random. This was punishment by theater. The real problem was that she still could not afford to react like she knew. Not yet. The complaint had finally moved into formal channels 2 days earlier through a route Harlan did not control. A victim advocate had notes. A legal office had a preliminary timeline. Another female Marine, older and close to ES, had quietly agreed to speak if asked. The system had not become trustworthy overnight, but for the first time, there was structure outside Harlan's reach, which meant the pressure on Carter had suddenly become more dangerous. Men like Harlan often get sloppiest when they sense the perimeter closing. That morning, Ruiz looked sick. Carter found her tying and readying the same boot lace outside the female head. "You do not have to watch that block if you don't want to," Carter said. Ruiz gave a brittle half-laugh. "If I don't, they'll wonder why." "They may wonder anyway." Ruiz looked up. "Are you okay?" It was the wrong question and somehow the right one. Carter considered lying. Chose better. "I'm steady," she said. "That's enough." Ruiz nodded. She understood the language of holding on. What none of the Marines filing into that bay knew was that 3 separate timelines were converging at once. On one line, a public training event was drifting toward spectacle. On another, a formal complaint was gaining traction beneath the surface. On the third, Callahan, loud, visible, careless, was about to place himself directly in the path of a truth he had been helping conceal without ever seeing its full shape. He was not the mastermind. That mattered, because villains who think they're protagonists often do the most damage while believing they are simply enforcing order. Before the demonstration began, Harlan made one circuit of the bay with a clipboard in hand, as if he were checking attendance. He stopped to speak with 2 lieutenants. He clapped one corporal on the shoulder. He passed within 10 feet of Carter and never looked at her. That was a message, too. You are beneath notice. You are already handled. Carter noticed something else. A woman in civilian business clothes near the rear entrance, speaking briefly with the executive officer before taking a position along the wall. Not from a battalion. Not there for martial arts sustainment. Hair pulled back, legal pad in hand, face expressionless. Carter did not stare, but she recognized the timing. The complaint was moving faster than she had expected. Maybe someone higher had finally seen enough. Maybe another case touched this one. Maybe the command was about to discover that silence is not the same thing as safety. And suddenly the demonstration felt less like an isolated humiliation and more like the last bad decision of men who thought they still owned the script. Callahan stepped onto the mat, energized. He was good in front of people, and that kind of confidence feeds on itself. He opened with technique review, control positions, movement principles. He wasn't faking competence. That was the difficult part. Abusive environments are often maintained by people who are genuinely good at parts of their job. It makes the harm harder to name and easier to excuse. Size matters less than leverage, he told the room. A few Marines smirked because they knew exactly where he was going. He called Carter forward. She moved without hesitation, which disappointed him for a second because he had been hoping for visible reluctance. He compensated with humor. "Everybody give Sergeant Carter some space," he said. "Don't want any fingers missing before liberty." There was again the line, refined through repetition. The room laughed because the room had been taught to laugh. What they didn't know was that Carter had been waking before Reveille for 3 weeks to train alone in the auxiliary mat room when it was empty. Not because she feared the demonstration, because stress lives in the body, and she refused to let theirs decide her timing. She drilled footwork until it became breath, entries until they became instinct, breakfalls until the sound of impact no longer spiked her pulse. If the day turned physical, she would not be improvising. She would be choosing. That was her kind of competence. Preparation, so quiet it looks like luck to spectators. Callahan began with light contact to illustrate grip fighting. She gave him exactly enough resistance to keep the demonstration credible and no more. He corrected her posture loudly despite there being nothing wrong with it. He repositioned her by the elbow like she was a prop. He told the Marines to watch for aggression indicators with a half glance in her direction. Still, she stayed composed, and that composure unnerved him more than visible anger would have. There is a point in every public humiliation where the aggressor realizes the target is not shrinking correctly, not breaking right, not giving the audience the emotional shape they were promised. That is when mockery hardens, when the performer starts taking risks. Callahan crossed that point. He increased pace, switched from demonstration touch to competitive pressure, crowded her space, forced exchanges he could dominate physically. Every move still deniable as training. Every move designed to make the final imbalance look inevitable. Harlan watched from the wall, face blank. Ruiz watched from the third row, hands folded so tight her knuckles blanched. And Carter watched everyone. That was the thing about her. She was never only in one fight. She felt the room tipping before the room did. When Callahan said, "Let's make this real," the energy changed. He probably thought he was escalating to a harmless flourish. Something decisive. Something that would send the message he had been building for months. A quick control. A stumble. Maybe a pin. He would help her up afterward, grin for the audience, and the lesson would be complete. Know your place, laugh along, take the correction, and don't imagine the crowd will ever turn. He didn't know the legal observer at the back had been writing down his language. He didn't know 2 other Marines had already been interviewed that morning. He didn't know Ruiz had finally handed over the screenshot. He didn't know the command story was already fraying. And he definitely didn't know the woman in front of him had spent most of her adult life learning how to let larger bodies tell her exactly where they intended to fall. The mystery was never whether Emily Carter could fight. The mystery was why she had spent so long pretending that proving it mattered less than protecting something else. Now the answer was seconds away. Callahan reached with his right hand high and stepped in deep, weight forward, heel just slightly misaligned on the mat from the speed of the entry. To a casual observer, it looked aggressive but controlled. To Carter, it was an unlocked door. Later, Marines would argue over the details. Some swore she trapped the wrist first. Others said she pivoted under the arm. One corporal insisted the entire thing happened too fast to process, that 1 second Callahan was grinning and the next gravity had betrayed him. What actually happened was simpler, and because it was simpler, it was devastating. She moved first with her feet, a small lateral slip, then the turn, then the hip, then his momentum, borrowed and redirected before his body understood the transaction. She didn't fight his strength. She made it irrelevant. The throw was clean enough to teach from, sharp enough to sting, controlled enough that nobody with real experience could call it reckless. That was important. She did not lose discipline. She demonstrated it at a level higher than anyone expected. He hit flat. Air burst from his lungs. The room stopped. And for 1 impossible second, every Marine present had to confront the gap between the story they had been telling themselves and the reality on the mat. Carter stepped clear, stance set, expression composed. Callahan stared up at the ceiling. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like the second after a round cracks overhead and everyone waits to find out where it landed. Then something even more revealing happened. Callahan flushed dark red and lunged to stand too quickly, not to continue the lesson, to reclaim the room. That is the instinct of men built by performance. When status cracks, they reach for speed. Reset, he snapped, breath uneven. Carter did not move. "Staff Sergeant," she said evenly, "you asked for committed movement." A tiny sentence, respectful in form, surgical in effect. Several Marines looked down immediately, trying not to be seen reacting. Callahan heard the tone beneath the words and understood, maybe for the first time, that she was not rattled, not lucky, not confused, and not remotely dependent on his version of events. He came at her again. That was his worst decision of the day, because now the room was watching differently. Not for entertainment, for truth. When a crowd senses that its original judgment may have been wrong, it becomes brutally attentive. Every gesture gains meaning. Every hesitation exposes intent. The audience that had protected Callahan with laughter now threatened him with clarity. He tried a more cautious entry. She broke posture, turned his shoulder, and checked him to one knee without spectacle. Controlled. Textbook. No extra force. Just enough to prove the first throw was not an accident. A murmur rippled through the formation. Not laughter. Recognition. Callahan froze there for half a beat, one knee on the mat, jaw clenched, and in that tiny pause the whole architecture of the joke began to collapse. Because once competence appears, ridicule has to retreat. It can no longer pretend to be instruction. Harlan moved first from the wall. He stepped forward with the speed of a man who understood the room had become dangerous in a new way. "That's enough," he said, not because he was concerned for safety, because exposure had entered the bay. The executive officer looked at him, then at the civilian observer, then at Carter, then at Callahan. And maybe it was the timing or the body language or the strange way guilt announces itself through the need to control sequence. But something clicked. Actually, the XO said, voice calm, "Let Sergeant Carter explain the movement." Harlan stopped. So did half the room's breathing. Carter did not look triumphant. That would have made the moment smaller. She simply demonstrated the entry in slow motion, using technical language, grip placement, center line, base disruption, rotational leverage. Her voice was low, steady, almost instructional to the point of mercy. She did not humiliate Callahan with words. She did not need to. She turned the event back into professional training, and by doing so, exposed who had dragged it elsewhere. That was the competence reveal. Not just that she could throw him, that she could restore order after he failed to. Marines noticed. The best ones noticed that kind of thing immediately. After the block ended, the bay did not empty in its usual noisy flow. Marines filed out in compressed clusters, whispering now, replaying what they had seen. A few looked at Carter differently for the first time. Not with pity, not with suspicion, with recalculation. Ruiz did not approach her. Smart. Too many eyes. Callahan disappeared into the instructor office. Harlan tried to intercept the civilian observer near the exit and was politely ignored. And by 1800, the command no longer controlled the story, because the throw had done something paperwork alone often cannot. It had forced people to question an assumption in public. Once that happens, old memories start rearranging. Marines remembered jokes they had brushed off, corrections that suddenly seemed personal. The weird frequency with which Carter's name had surfaced in negative banter. The way Ruiz had looked exhausted lately. The way Harlan hovered around certain Marines under the banner of mentorship. The mind, once cracked open, starts admitting evidence it had previously rejected for convenience. That evening, Callahan sat alone in his truck outside the barracks lot for 27 minutes without starting the engine. He was humiliated, yes. But beneath humiliation, another feeling had begun to move. Confusion. The bad kind. The kind that comes when a man realizes he may have been operating on borrowed certainty. He replayed the throw first. Her timing. Her control. The absence of panic in her face. Then he replayed the months before it. The jokes. The way she never bit back. The way Harlan had once laughed and said, "Carter's got teeth, just ask around," as though passing along harmless command folklore. A memory surfaced he had not taken seriously at the time. A corporal telling him Carter was actually solid, just dealing with something. Another, Ruiz stiffening when Harlan entered a room. Another, Carter asking, very formally, whether correction in front of junior Marines was the most effective venue for certain issues. At the time, he had taken all of it as attitude. Now, sitting in the dusk with his hands on the wheel, he felt the first clean edge of shame. Not enough yet, but enough to cut. The investigation accelerated the next morning. Not publicly. Institutions rarely move loudly at first, but the internal rhythm changed. Meetings appeared with unusual urgency. Doors closed. The victim advocate returned. Legal asked for more records. The battalion commander, who had spent too long trusting subordinate reporting overground truth, finally received a version of events not pre-filtered by Harlan's orbit. Carter was called in first. She brought a folder. Not dramatic. Not thick enough to look theatrical. Just organized. Dates. Notes. Screenshots. Times she had reported concerns indirectly. Times training interactions became personal. Times Ruiz's duties shifted after boundary setting. Names of Marines who might have noticed patterns if asked properly. Instances where Harlan inserted himself into circumstances that did not require him. Instances where Callahan amplified a rumor he could never source. The officer interviewing her asked when she had started documenting. "The first time I realized normal correction was being used as cover," she said. "Why not file immediately?" Carter held the question for a second. Not because she lacked an answer. Because she wanted to give the true one, not the easy one. Because the Marine affected most directly wasn't ready, she said. And because if I moved before she had structure, she would have been isolated. I could absorb that. She couldn't. That sentence traveled. Officers remember lines like that when they realize the person in front of them has been operating on a level of moral seriousness they themselves failed to match. Ruiz came in later and nearly backed out twice before the door closed. Carter was not in the room with her. She had insisted on that. Protection does not mean ownership. Ruiz needed her own voice. When she finally spoke, halting at first, and then with increasing precision, the complaint stopped being abstract. This matters. Predatory systems do not usually collapse because of one dramatic confession. They collapse when multiple small truths, each previously survivable on their own, align in a pattern too coherent to ignore. Another female Marine nearing separation described career guidance, meetings with Harlan that drifted into personal territory and retaliatory coldness when she disengaged. A sergeant from admin confirmed odd routing delays affecting Ruiz. A corporal admitted he had repeated the "she bites" rumor for weeks without ever knowing where it began. The legal observer from a martial arts block submitted notes documenting Callahan's language and the room's reaction. Even the XO, embarrassed by how much he had missed, provided a statement about Harlan's attempt to stop Carter from explaining the throw. Callahan was interviewed on day 2. He entered defensive. By minute 20, he was sweating. Not because they accused him of Harlan's full conduct, because they showed him how neatly his behavior fit into the pattern. The jokes, the pairings, the public corrections, the fact that he had treated Carter not as a sergeant with a record, but as a caricature whose backstory he had never verified. "Where did you hear that she was unstable?" Legal asked. He started with, "It was around. That is not a source." He shifted. "People said things." "Which people?" Silence. Then Harlan's name surfaced for the first time in Callahan's own mouth. Not as an accusation, as realization. "I figured if Gunny had concerns," he said slowly, "they were grounded." Grounded. That word hung in the room like a confession of laziness. Because that was the moral failure beneath everything else. Not merely cruelty. Delegated judgment. He had accepted a rumor because it was useful. Because it made his jokes land. Because it gave him permission to enjoy reducing someone. And now he had to face the possibility that he had chosen a target not because she deserved scrutiny, but because she was standing between a younger Marine and a senior man who wanted her easier to discredit. There are few moments uglier than the instant a grown man sees his own cowardice clearly. Callahan tried once to retreat into intention. "I didn't know," he said. The captain across from him nodded almost sadly. "That may be true," he replied. "But you certainly enjoyed not knowing. That broke something. Not enough to redeem him. Enough to make him honest." He described the meeting where Harlan suggested Carter had problems with aggression. He admitted he had repeated the line. Admitted he had chosen her for the demonstration partly because he thought public correction would settle her down. Admitted, with visible reluctance, that the room's laughter had encouraged him. That word too mattered. Encouraged. Toxic leadership is almost never a solo act. It feeds on audience participation. Meanwhile, Carter was still showing up to work. That detail haunted people later. She did not posture as a martyr. She did not seek allies in hallways. She did not start giving speeches about courage. She handled Marines, checked gear, followed process, and answered what was asked. The command that had mistaken her silence for weakness now had to live with a far harsher interpretation. She had been stronger than all of them while they were busy misjudging her. The major reversal was not just that Callahan got thrown. It was that the throw forced everyone to revise who had actually been in control all along. Not Harlan, for all his influence. Not Callahan, for all his volume. Carter, because she had chosen when to absorb and when to act. She had decided what mattered more than being liked. She had kept Ruiz from being consumed before the system could be forced to look. She had prepared for public humiliation without surrendering professional precision. And when the moment came, she did not simply defeat a man on a mat. She exposed a lie in front of 340 witnesses. That is why they never forgot it. Not the technique. The reclassification of reality. Harlan fought hard once he understood the scope. Men with long careers and decaying power always do. He denied intent, called interactions misunderstood, blamed generational sensitivity, suggested Carter had orchestrated resentment because she had career frustrations, suggested Ruiz had misread mentorship, suggested Callahan's training style, while spirited, had nothing to do with him. Every line was familiar. Every line had worked before. This time, the pattern held, because the throw had produced witnesses willing to rethink themselves. That was the hidden effect nobody predicts. Once a group sees a confident falsehood collapse publicly, it becomes easier for individuals inside that group to admit what they privately suspected. The social cost of honesty decreases. The social cost of silence rises. Marines who had said nothing for months now came forward with small observations. Not enough individually to headline a scandal. Enough together to construct one. A lance corporal remembered Harlan insisting on one-on-one career discussions late in the day with female Marines, but almost never male ones. A clerk remembered routed requests that sat mysteriously until certain conversations occurred. A sergeant recalled Harlan referring to Carter as temperamental before Callahan ever used the phrase. Another remembered Callahan laughing after a formation and saying, "She just needs the right kind of handling." Each memory was a thread. Together, they formed a rope. By the end of the week, Harlan was removed from operational access pending investigation. The news spread with the speed unique to military spaces. Door to door, smoke pit to motor pool, barracks room to mess line, always prefaced by certainty no one technically had, and yet somehow truer than the official silence. Some Marines reacted with vindicated anger, some with defensive discomfort. A few with that look institutions produce in people who suddenly realize they built part of their identity around a command climate that was never honorable to begin with. Callahan requested to speak with Carter. She declined the first time, accepted the second, but only in an office with the door open and another staff NCO within sight. He came in stripped of swagger. Same body, different posture. It is astonishing how much smaller a person becomes once performance leaves them. He stood for a moment, as if unsure whether he still had the right to take up air in front of her. "I was wrong," he said finally. She waited, not coldly, just without helping him. "I heard things," he continued. "I didn't verify. I used it. I thought." He shook his head once. "I thought I was checking attitude. I was making you a joke." Carter's face did not change, because apologies sometimes arrive after the injured party has already done all the emotional work required to survive without them. He tried again. "I didn't know what was happening with Ruiz." She answered at last. "No," she said. "You didn't." There was no comfort in the words, only fact, and that wasn't neutral. He absorbed that. Maybe for the first time in his career, he heard responsibility described without shouting, without profanity, without any escape hatch in a misunderstanding. "I'll testify to what I said," he told her. "You should testify to what you did," Carter replied. That landed harder. He nodded, left. She sat alone afterward for 60 seconds, maybe 90, hands folded once they stopped shaking. Because strength is not the absence of reaction. It is the discipline to decide where reaction belongs. She had saved it for private air. The institutional consequence came in layers. Harlan's reputation collapsed faster than his case resolved. Once command confidence leaves a senior enlisted leader, it does not return quietly. Duties vanished. Access narrowed. Men who had once orbited him found reasons to be elsewhere. Formal findings would take time, but social gravity had already changed. Powerful people do not fear accusation as much as they fear becoming unprotected. Callahan retained rank, but not innocence. Administrative action followed, then removal from certain instructional responsibilities. His peers stopped laughing quite so easily. He was not ruined in the cinematic sense. Real systems are rarely that clean, but he was marked, and more importantly, he knew why. The battalion received mandatory climate briefings that felt too late because they were. Leaders used all the correct words: dignity, accountability, trust, professionalism. Some meant them. Some were just surviving the blast radius. Marines listened with the stunned fatigue of people who had recently learned how many of their instincts were socially rented rather than morally earned. And Emily Carter? She did not become a mascot for resilience. Thank God. That would have been another form of theft. Instead, she became difficult to categorize in a different, healthier way. Junior Marines sought her out more carefully now, not because she was suddenly inspiring, a word people often use when they want to consume someone else's pain at a safe distance, but because they trusted her standards. They had seen what they were worth under pressure. Ruiz began to sleep again. Not well at first. Better later. She finished the cycle, requested transfer, got it, and before leaving the battalion, she stopped by Carter's workspace with a folded note she could not quite bring herself to hand over in person. Carter found it after evening chow tucked under a training binder. It was short. "Thank you for not making me move before I could stand." Carter read it once, then again, then placed it inside the same folder that had held all the dates and screenshots. Not as proof for command anymore, as proof for herself. Because even the strongest people need evidence, sometimes, that the cost was not imaginary. Months later, Marines still told the story of the throw, but never the same way twice. Memory dramatizes. Some swore Callahan had flown. Others added expressions he never made. A few reduced everything to a neat morality play because people prefer decisive moments to messy processes. But the Marines who really understood it told it differently. They talked about the silence after impact. They talked about the way Carter explained the technique without a tremor in her voice. They talked about how quickly the whole room realized the joke had been built on sand. Most of all, they talked about how stupid they felt for mistaking restraint for fragility. That was the legacy, not that a smaller Marine beat a bigger one. That would have been impressive and forgettable. The unforgettable part was discovering that the person they had all underestimated had been carrying a heavier operational load than anyone in the room. Not a rucksack, not a casualty, a moral burden. The burden of timing truth so it could survive. There is no award ribbon for that. No clean ceremony. No band playing while someone pins recognition on the blouse of a Marine who refused to abandon another Marine to institutional convenience. What there is sometimes is memory. Hard memory. Corrective memory. The kind that lives inside a unit long after the paper trail is archived. A year after the investigation, a young corporal who had been in that bay as a private told the story to a new arrival who laughed at the phrase before knowing its weight. "Careful, she bites?" the new Marine repeated. The corporal shook his head. "No," he said. "That's what idiots said before they learned what discipline looks like. That is how legends really form in military spaces. Not from perfection, from revision. From one event forcing a whole group of people to confront how casually they had participated in someone else's diminishment." And for Carter, the aftermath was quieter than people imagine. No dramatic transfer. No sudden promotion showered down as compensation. Life does not usually honor courage so neatly. She kept working, kept teaching, kept insisting on paperwork done right and language used carefully, and young Marines treated like human beings rather than raw material for someone else's ego. If anything, she became more exacting. Not harder, clearer. Because once you have watched a command mistake mockery for leadership, you never again treat culture as background noise. One afternoon, long after the scandal had moved off center stage, Carter was running a fundamentals block with a mixed group of junior Marines. Entries, base, balance falling safely. Nothing theatrical, just essentials. Ruiz was gone to her new unit by then. Harlan was history people still avoided naming too directly. Callahan had been rotated elsewhere. The room held none of the same tension. A lance corporal missed a step and went down awkwardly, embarrassed. The group chuckled. Not cruelly, reflexively. Carter stopped the block. Again, she said. The Marine reset. She demonstrated the movement once more, slower, then had him repeat it until he got it right. When he did, she nodded. Good. That's how you learn. The room stayed quiet. Not fearful. Corrected. That is leadership too. Not the big speech. Not the righteous pose. The consistent shaping of what a room believes it is allowed to laugh at. Later, alone while stacking mats, Carter thought of the first time she learned to fall in that church rec hall back home. Her mother's hands guiding her shoulder. The lesson spoken in a tone so matter-of-fact it took years to fully understand. Don't fight the ground. Meet it right, and get back up before someone decides your story for you. She had done that. Again and again. Not only on the mat. In the office. In the barracks. In the invisible terrain where reputation, silence, and institutional fear grind people down. That was why the throw mattered beyond spectacle. It was the first visible sign of a reality she had been living all along. She was never the weak point in the story. She was the hinge. Everything turned on whether she bent. She didn't. And when powerful men finally lost control of the narrative, they did not lose it to outrage alone. They lost it to precision, to notes kept at midnight, to a younger Marine protected long enough to speak in her own name, to a public act executed without ego, to a refusal, absolute and disciplined, to apologize for competence simply because it embarrassed the wrong person. That refusal spread, not like rebellion, like clarity. Marines who witnessed it carried the lesson into other rooms. Some started checking the origin of stories before repeating them. Some intervened earlier when a joke got too convenient. Some re-examined the way command favorites were selected and shielded. Not everybody changed. Institutions never transform all at once. But enough did. Enough to matter. And somewhere inside that battalion's institutional memory, deeper than the investigation summaries and corrective action memos, deeper than the whispered barracks retellings, one image remained untouched by revision. A crowded bay, a line meant to diminish, a bigger man stepping in with the whole room on his side, and a smaller Marine, silent for months for reasons no one had earned the right to know, choosing exactly one moment to let physics tell the truth. By then it was never just about who hit the mat. It was about who had been carrying the weight. That is why the men who laughed stopped laughing. That is why the silence after the throw felt so heavy. And that is why, years later, the story still holds. Because 340 Marines did not just witness a takedown. They witnessed the instant a lie lost its balance and never got back up. And if that had been the end of it, the story still would have traveled. A room full of Marines sees a smaller sergeant drop a louder staff sergeant in front of half the battalion. And that image alone is enough to survive on memory for years. People would have told it in smoke pits and chow lines. They would have used it as shorthand for humility, for underestimation, for why size and swagger are not the same thing as control. But the throw was only the moment everybody could see. The real story kept moving in places where crowds were not allowed. Behind office doors, inside interview rooms, in statements typed, corrected, retyped, and signed with hands that did not always stop shaking. And as the days passed, the hardest truth of all started coming into focus. Emily Carter had not just defended herself. She had absorbed pressure that should have broken the command months earlier, and she had done it so precisely that by the time people finally looked in the right direction, the damage could still be named. That is rare. Rare in any institution. Rarer in one built on hierarchy, speed, and the constant temptation to confuse endurance with silence. The week after the demonstration, the battalion moved like a body with an internal injury. Externally, everything still functioned. Trucks still rolled. Rosters still printed. Formations still happened on time. Marines still ran PT under wet heat and pale morning sky. Orders still came down. Accountability still got taken. On the surface, nothing had changed except the faces people made when certain names were mentioned. Underneath, everything had changed. The first sign was how careful the jokes became. Men who had once filled dead air with easy mockery started measuring their words. Not because they had all suddenly evolved into better people overnight, because they had felt the floor shift under a false certainty, And once a person experiences that, even once, they become aware of risk in a new way. If Carter had been misread that badly, who else had they misread? If Harlan had been playing games with access, assignments, and intimidation, what other normal patterns inside the battalion were really pressure systems in disguise? The command had not just lost a rumor. It had lost innocence. That made everyone uneasy, and unease is useful when a system has been too comfortable for too long. Carter did not enjoy watching that discomfort spread. That mattered. Lesser people do. They savor reversal. They grow theatrical once the current runs in their direction. Carter never did. She understood too well what it meant for truth to arrive late. Late truth still hurts the innocent. Late truth still means damage was allowed to mature. Late truth still means someone smaller, younger, or more alone had to spend nights wondering if what was happening to them would ever sound real to anyone else. So she did not move through the battalion like a victor. She moved like a Marine who had more work to do. That, more than anything, confused the people who had expected either collapse or retaliation. They did not know what to do with a woman who had every reason to turn bitter and instead became more exact. On the third day of interviews, a lieutenant colonel from outside the battalion arrived to oversee additional review. That detail spread by noon without anyone needing to confirm it. Outsiders at that level do not appear for routine friction. They appear when confidence has broken and somebody higher wants clean eyes on a dirty room. He was older, spare, measured, the kind of officer who had long ago learned that the quietest question in a room often produces the most accurate answer. He spent 2 hours in command offices first. Then he walked the training spaces alone. Then he asked to see the bay where the demonstration happened. Nobody knew exactly what he was looking for. Carter had a guess. Scene matters, not just facts. Distances, visibility, where Harlan had stood, where the legal observer had been. How many Marines had direct line of sight? Whether the event had really been framed as instruction or if, at a glance, it would already have looked like spectacle to someone less invested in defending it. When she was brought in again, he did something most investigators forget to do. He asked her about sequence before motive. "Walk me through the room," he said. So she did. She described the map placement, the rank distribution in the audience, the timing of Callahan's comments, the fact that the joke landed not because it was spontaneous, but because it was already familiar. She described the way Harlan tried to terminate the moment only after control had shifted. She described the executive officer's intervention, not dramatically, not as accusation, as structure. Then the lieutenant colonel asked, "When did you know the rumor had become operational?" That question would have lost some people. Not Carter. The second it started altering how correction was delivered, she said. A joke is social until it affects decision-making. After that, it's a tool. He looked at her for a long second after she said it. That line, too, would be repeated later, because it named something large and ugly with frightening precision. A joke is social until it affects decision-making. After that, it's a tool. That was the whole scandal in one sentence. Not only Harlan's conduct, not only Callahan's participation, the entire climate. How mockery moved from recreation to mechanism. How rumor became an instrument that helped a senior man isolate young women, discredit resistance, and recruit louder personalities into doing damage for him without fully understanding the machine they were inside. The lieutenant colonel asked why she had tolerated it as long as she did. Again, she gave the answer nobody in the room could comfortably improve. "Because I had more margin than Ruiz did," she said. "And because if they were spending energy on me, they had less room to close around her." That answer hit him the way certain battlefield reports hit experienced people. Not with surprise, with recognition. He had heard versions of that logic before in combat. One person drawing pressure because someone else could not survive the same exposure. One person choosing to become absorbent until the right moment to move. That it had happened in a stateside battalion, under fluorescent lights and routine authority, made it more obscene, not less. The review widened after that. Past transfer records, previous climate surveys, unresolved personnel complaints that had been marked as interpersonal friction, mentorship misunderstanding, leadership style conflict. The bland language of institutions is often where buried harm goes to sleep. Pull enough of those threads and patterns emerge that were invisible only because nobody wanted to see them side by side. And there it was. Not a single perfect smoking gun. Something more real. A long line of small manipulations repeated across years. A corporal who had once asked for a shift change after persistent discomfort around Harlan and then withdrawn the request a day later. A former lance corporal from another company who reported feeling pressured into private career coaching and suddenly lost recommendation support for a school seat after she stopped attending. A staff sergeant's old note about recurring rumored discipline attached to female Marines who became less cooperative with Harlan's one-on-one involvement. A pattern so unspectacular on paper that it had survived precisely because nobody had ever forced it into a single frame. Until now, this is how abuse often wins. It fragments itself. It turns every event into a separate file, every victim into an isolated interpretation problem, every warning sign into a personality issue, every discomfort into ambiguity. Then it relies on exhaustion. People get tired of pursuing fragments that do not yet look like a whole. Carter had understood that instinctively, which was why her folder mattered so much. She had not documented one event. She had documented relationship, pressure, timing, repetition, narrative shaping. She had treated the whole thing like what it really was, a system. That level of thinking did not come from nowhere. Long before the Marines, long before rank, before paperwork and command climates and staff and CO politics, there had been a winter when Emily Carter was 14 and her mother took her to a local tournament in an old middle school gym with weak heat and folding chairs lined crooked against the wall. Emily was the smallest girl in her bracket, too quiet, too narrow through the shoulders, and one of the mothers from another town made the mistake adults sometimes make when they assume children cannot hear them. "She looks breakable," the woman said. Emily had heard it. Her mother had heard it too, but she said nothing on the spot. No lecture, no scene, no defense. Later, while taping Emily's fingers before the first match, she spoke in a flat, practical tone she always used when teaching something that would matter for years. "People say a lot of things when they've only looked once," she said. "Don't educate them with your mouth if your timing can do it cleaner." Emily remembered that line, not because it sounded profound, because it worked. She won that day by points, by patience, by making bigger girls overreach until their balance wrote the ending for them. On the drive home, her mother did not praise her for winning. She praised her for not rushing to answer the wrong question. "Everybody wanted to know if you were tough," her mother said at a red light. "You let them discover you were trained. That lasts longer." Years later, in uniform, that distinction still lived in her bones. Tough is noisy. Trained is durable. That difference is what most of the battalion finally began to understand. Not that Carter could dominate every fight. That was never the point. The point was that she had been operating on a level of discipline the people around her had not even recognized as strength. Callahan recognized it too late. The shame had settled into him by stages. First humiliation, then confusion, then the ugly dawning knowledge that he had been easy to use. Then, after the interview, something heavier, moral embarrassment. It showed up physically. He slept badly, woke with his jaw clenched, lost patience faster than usual, stopped lingering in common areas where conversations might shift when he approached. Marines noticed. They always notice when confidence leaks out of somebody who used to wear it like armor. One evening, a week after his interview, he walked down to the empty pull-up bars near the edge of the company area and found Gunnery Sergeant Flores there alone, chalking his hands before a set. Flores was not part of the scandal, not close to Harlan, not especially close to Carter either. But he was one of those Marines who had survived long enough to see human patterns clearly and did not waste energy pretending otherwise. Callahan almost turned around. Flores saw him and said, "You can stay." So he stayed. For a while, neither man said anything. The sky was dimming violet over the tree line. Somebody somewhere was laughing outside the barracks. A bugle call drifted thin through the humidity. Normal sounds. Uncomfortable evening. Finally, Callahan asked, "You think I'm finished?" Flores dropped from the bar and landed softly. That depends what you mean. Callahan stared ahead. As a leader, Flores wiped his hands on his shorts. You weren't leading when you did it. The answer landed like a hammer because it did not offer the dignity of argument. Callahan exhaled. I didn't think it was that deep. No, Flores said. You thought it was funny. That's silence again. Funny is expensive, Flores went on, especially when you bill it to the wrong person. Callahan looked down. I said I'd testify. Good. That's the floor, not the ceiling. He wanted more. Some path, some steps, some sequence that could convert guilt into progress fast enough to let him stop feeling it. Flores saw that too. Don't rush to become the hero of your apology, he said. You were useful to something rotten. Learn why. That conversation would sit in Callahan's mind for a long time because it denied him the easiest escape, which is to feel bad in a way that still keeps your own reflection at the center. Meanwhile, Ruiz faced a different kind of burden. Relief is not clean when it arrives after fear. People imagine survivors feel instantly lighter once they are believed. Sometimes they do. Often they don't. Belief creates new demands. Retelling. Clarifying. Watching your own memory become evidence. Seeing parts of your experience discussed in administrative language that seems too sterile to contain what it actually felt like to live inside it. Ruiz had nightmares for weeks after speaking in full. Not just about Harlan, about rooms, about being asked to repeat herself while faces remained blank, about becoming the center of a story she had wanted only to survive. Carter knew that stage, not personally, but structurally. She had seen enough Marines stagger under lesser institutional processes to understand the aftershock. So she did not hover. That was another act of competence. People think support means constant presence. Often it means calibrated distance. Knowing when your strength starts becoming another pressure on someone who needs to rediscover their own center. Carter checked in the way professionals do. Brief, direct, never forcing feeling into words it wasn't ready to wear. You eating? Yes, Sergeant. Sleeping? Sometimes. Right when you can. Breathe when you remember. Don't make yourself perform recovery for anybody. Ruiz nodded every time, and every time she looked more anchored afterward, not because the fear vanished, but because somebody had once again refused to make her pain decorative. That changed her. It changed how she would later lead, too, because people who are protected correctly rarely forget the shape of that protection. While the official inquiry expanded, the unofficial story inside the battalion kept mutating. There were already Marines trying to simplify it into something safer. Some wanted to make Carter into a mythic fighter because talking about technique was easier than talking about command failure. Some wanted to reduce Harlan to a singular monster because systems feel less threatening if you can isolate them inside one bad actor. Some wanted to make Callahan the sole villain because it relieved everyone else of participation. All of those versions were incomplete, and Carter, whether she liked it or not, became the fixed point around which those incomplete versions had to be tested. A captain from headquarters stopped her after a meeting one afternoon and said, awkwardly, "You've handled this with a lot of grace." She looked at him for a moment and answered, "I've handled it with a lot of documentation." He blinked. That line spread too. Not because it was rude, because it was corrective. Grace is what institutions call endurance when they want to compliment the wounded without confronting the machinery that wounded them. Documentation is harder. Documentation implies preventability. It implies sequence. It implies that somebody could have known sooner if they had wanted to know. He did not make the mistake twice. In the second week, more women came forward from outside the battalion. Not an avalanche. Real life is rarely that neat. But enough. One former Marine, now a civilian working near Jacksonville, agreed to a phone interview after hearing Harlan's name resurface through old friends. Her account went back years. Same pattern. Career, mentorship, personal drift, punitive chill when boundaries were set. Nothing dramatic enough, at the time, to justify detonating your own position over. Everything significant enough, in retrospect, to reveal intent. That was the sentence she used. At the time, every single thing felt almost explainable, she said. That was the trap. No one moment looked strong enough to carry the whole truth. Investigators wrote that down. They should have, because it named the design. A system of harms built to remain individually survivable by outsiders and cumulatively crushing to insiders. When the battalion commander was finally briefed on the full emerging pattern, several witnesses later said he looked physically older by the end of the meeting. Not because he had committed Harlan's acts, because command failure has its own face, and one version of that face is a good man realizing his idea of what he had been leading does not match what had actually been happening under his authority. He called for a closed session with senior leaders. No speeches leaked from it, but the consequences did. Harlan's access was further restricted. Reporting channels were re-announced with unusual emphasis. Line leaders received direct instruction about retaliation, rumor conduct, witness contact, and documentation preservation. More importantly, the commander began bypassing some internal relays entirely. If trust in the chain has been compromised, routing truth through the same old pipes is how you poison it again. Marines felt the seriousness in the administrative details. The way people suddenly stopped being casual about written records. The way meeting invites gained witnesses. The way once unanswered emails began receiving prompt acknowledgement. Institutions tell on themselves and their process shifts. And still, none of that was the hardest part. The hardest part was cultural. A battalion can implement safeguards in days. It takes longer to teach people why they laughed. That lesson came in strange places. In squad bays after lights out, when younger Marines asked older ones whether they had ever seen that kind of targeting before and got answers much slower and more uncomfortable than expected. In vehicles on the way to ranges, when the easy banter ran out and somebody finally admitted, "I repeated that line for weeks and never once asked where it came from." In women's heads, where old memories clicked into new alignment, and people started reclassifying experiences they had minimized because the command climate had given them no attractive vocabulary for resistance. In men's heads too, though fewer admitted it. Part of institutional adulthood is recognizing the moments you outsourced your conscience to atmosphere. Many of the Marines in that battalion had done exactly that. Not all maliciously. Some through immaturity. Some through fear. Some because the line between belonging and dissent in military culture can feel thinner than civilians understand. But whether the motive was cowardice, passivity, or social hunger, the effect remained. They helped create the air Carter had to breathe. That is what haunted the better ones once the pattern was undeniable. One night, weeks after the throw, a corporal named Jensen knocked on Carter's office door after most people had gone. He had been in the bay that day. Big kid from Idaho. Reliable enough. Not cruel by nature. But he had laughed. He stood there visibly miserable. "Sergeant," he said, "I wanted to tell you I was one of the ones laughing." Carter looked up from paperwork. He kept going because stopping would have been cowardice. "I didn't know. That's not an excuse. It was normal by then. The whole thing with what people said about you. I joined in because everybody already treated it like fact." She let him say it. That mattered. Confession does something useful only when it completes itself. "I'm sorry," he said. She studied him for a second, not as judge, but as leader. "Then don't become the kind of man who needs the room to know what's right before you do," she said. That sentence hit him harder than any dressing down would have. Years later, he would still remember the feeling of it. And in some future command, when a younger Marine became the target of some easy consensus, he would hear her voice before he heard the crowd. That is how real change travels. Not through posters, through memory under pressure. The administrative process dragged, as all serious ones do. Recommendations, reviews, legal thresholds, career implications, statements needing corroboration, even when everyone in the room already understood the moral shape of the truth. Some people found that frustrating. Carter did too, though she hid it better. She had not fought this long to be shocked by institutional slowness. But she also knew something equally important. If the case was going to survive, it had to survive the standards powerful men would use against it. So she kept her discipline. No freelancing. No hallway activism. No contamination of witnesses. No emotional speechifying that defense counsel could later reframe as agenda. Precision again. Always precision. It was one of the reasons the inquiry held together. Carter understood that righteous anger, while justified, can become tactically wasteful if it is not aimed correctly. Harlan would have loved a sloppy overreach. He would have loved one screaming confrontation, one reckless accusation, one witness coached too obviously, one timeline embellished under the pressure of wanting justice faster than facts can safely move. He never got it, because the woman he underestimated most was not built for sloppiness. A month after the demonstration, the battalion held a mandatory leadership stand-down. Marines hated the phrase before the event even began. Too many stand-downs are ceremonial regret disguised as reform. Too many are more about insulating command than confronting culture. This one started that way. PowerPoint, definitions, reporting options, respect language, standard lines. Then the commander did something unexpected. He closed the slides and spoke without notes. He did not name ongoing investigations. He did not violate process. But he addressed the one thing institutional briefings usually avoid because it implicates the room itself. We are very practiced, he said, at identifying clear misconduct after it is undeniable. We are less practiced at identifying the climate that makes misconduct cheaper. The room went still. We talk often about courage under visible pressure. We talk less about moral laziness under social pressure. A rumor repeated enough times can become permission. A joke repeated enough times can become policy. If you think that sounds dramatic, ask yourself how many of you change your behavior towards someone based on a story you never verified. No one moved. He let it sit. Some of you are upset because this battalion has been embarrassed. You should be more upset that a Marine had to carry this much alone before we were. That line struck hard precisely because it did not flatter the audience. It denied them the comfort of thinking the scandal was chiefly about public optics. For the first time, many of the Marines who had been waiting for the command to tell them how to feel were instead being told to examine how they had helped create the conditions. It was overdue, but overdue truth still matters. Carter sat in the middle rows and listened without expression. She did not need vindication from speeches. Still, that one line, more upset that a Marine had to carry this much alone, lodged somewhere deep. Not because it healed anything, because somebody in authority had finally described the burden correctly. Callahan sat 2 sections over and stared straight ahead the entire time. He had started keeping his own notes by then, not for defense, for inventory, where he had heard what, when he had repeated it, which Marines had laughed because he led the laugh, which moments he now recognized as invitations to intervene that he had mistaken for entertainment. That work was ugly, necessary and ugly. He almost showed the pages to Flores once. Didn't. Kept them private. Some reckonings should not be performed. Months later, when formal action against Harlan moved from probable to all but certain, Callahan gave one more statement. Cleaner. More direct. He stopped using phrases like I thought and I assumed. Started saying I did. I repeated. I amplified. I made it easier. Language matters at that stage. Passive phrasing is how people try to sound honest without fully touching their agency. He touched it. Too late to undo anything. Not too late to stop lying. That distinction is where adulthood begins for a lot of men. By autumn, Ruiz had transferred. The day she left, the air was cool for once, sky bright and thin over the lot. The kind of Carolina morning that tricks you into believing every hard season can be zipped shut and loaded into a trunk. She moved her sea bags with clipped efficiency, refusing offers of unnecessary help. Carter watched from a distance until Ruiz finished stowing the last one, then walked over. No long goodbye, no cinematic embrace. Just 2 Marines standing beside a government sedan with the smell of dew still rising off the pavement. You ready? Carter asked. Ruiz took a breath. Ready enough. That answer made Carter almost smile. Ruiz hesitated, then said, I used to think strength looked loud. Carter leaned one shoulder against the car. A lot of people do. Ruiz nodded. I don't anymore. There it was. Not gratitude exactly. Inheritance. The transfer driver called for final timing. Ruiz opened the passenger door, then turned back once more. They all saw the throw, she said. but I saw what came before it. Carter held her gaze. That's why it mattered. Ruiz got in. The car rolled out. Carter stood there until it cleared the gate and was gone. Only then did she let herself feel the thin, sharp grief hidden inside successful protection. Because protection costs something from the protector too. Not just time, not just reputation. Attachment. You carry someone through a dangerous corridor, and then, if you did it right, they eventually walk beyond your reach. That is success. It still hurts. The findings against Harlan became formal near the end of the year. Career ending without needing every lurid detail the rumor mill would later invent. Substantiated misuse of position. Improper conduct. Retaliatory patterning. Breakdown of trust severe enough that his continued leadership became indefensible. The exact language mattered to lawyers and personnel systems. What mattered to everyone else was simpler. He had spent years shaping the climate to protect himself. And finally, that climate had turned into evidence against him. The irony was brutal. The very rumor logic he had used so effectively became part of the case. The lines passed through intermediaries. The selective correction, the reputational preparation of women who became inconvenient. None of it was random enough anymore to hide behind culture. Once mapped, it looked designed. Because it was. Harlan departed without ceremony. No grand final formation. No warm send-off. No polished speech about decades of service. Just administrative removal and the strange, deflating silence that follows powerful men when the machinery stops pretending they're necessary. Some Marines expected Carter to feel triumphant. She didn't. What she felt, more than anything, was tired. Bone tired. Not the tiredness of overwork. The tiredness that comes after holding tension for too long and finally discovering your nervous system does not immediately trust safety just because paperwork says danger has been addressed. She started waking at 0315 for a while. No nightmare, no clear thought, just instant alertness. She would lie there staring into dark, hearing distant HVAC hum and the occasional muffled slam of a barracks door, while her body debated whether it was still required to stand watch. Eventually, she started running at those hours. Not fast, not for score, just miles under moonlight and sodium lamps, boots of night workers echoing in the distance, coastal air cold in her lungs, until exhaustion reintroduced choice to a body that had spent too many months braced against invisible contact. One morning near dawn, Flores fell in a step beside her without invitation or small talk. They ran a mile in silence. Then another. At the turnaround, he said, "You know you don't have to keep proving you can carry things." She kept her pace. "I know. You don't sound convinced." She exhaled. "I sound awake." That almost got a smile out of him. After a while, he said, "The unit will make this into a story that serves whatever lesson it wants. Might be humility. Might be courage. Might be anti-rumor. Might be women in leadership. Might be all of it. Just remember, none of that has to be your full job." She looked over once, surprised not by the content, but by the accuracy. He shrugged. "Seen it before. Institution gets hurt. Then it wants the wounded person to help narrate the healing." That was exactly what she had sensed and had not yet put into words. "Not interested," she said. "Good." They ran the rest without speaking. That conversation protected her in a different way. It reminded her that boundaries do not end when the obvious villain exits. Institutions, even while trying to improve, often reach too eagerly for symbolic labor from the people they failed. Tell us how to talk about this. Stand here while we demonstrate learning. Become our proof that we are better now. Carter refused that role whenever she could. She trained Marines. She answered necessary questions. She gave factual input when asked by leadership trying honestly to correct process. But she would not become the command's redemptive mascot. That refusal was healthy. And because it was healthy, some people mistook it for coldness. So be it. People who need visible softness from the injured are often asking the injured to make recovery feel easier for everyone else. Winter came, then a new training cycle. New Marines arrived with only fragments of the old story. Some heard the famous line first. Some heard there had been a scandal. Some heard Carter was intense, which made a few older Marines quietly correct them before the word could harden into another lazy shorthand. That was new. Correction from peers before leadership had to step in. It sounds small. It isn't. Culture changes first at the level of interruption. One afternoon, a new private, not knowing any history, joked after a drill that Carter must be one of those scary types. The corporal nearest him shut it down instantly. "No," he said. "What's scary is how easy it is to start talking about people you haven't understood yet." The private looked confused, then embarrassed. Good. Embarrassment is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is education entering through the only door pride left unlocked. Not every reaction was admirable. A few Marines resented the entire aftermath, not because they believed Harlan innocent, but because they felt the battalion had become too careful, as if professionalism were an inconvenience imposed on them by scandal rather than the baseline they should have been maintaining all along. Those people always exist. Every corrective environment produces some backlash from personalities who mistake reduced impunity for oppression. Carter ignored most of it, but once, during a logistics prep meeting, a staff NCO from another section muttered that people are afraid to joke now. Carter looked up and answered before anyone else could. Then maybe learn the difference between joking and shaping somebody's options. Nothing more. The room moved on. Yet later, two sergeants who had heard that line repeated it elsewhere. Not because it was clever, but because it clarified a boundary they had never articulated. Again, that is how change spreads. Non-slogans, unusable distinctions. By spring, the battalion was no longer defined solely by the scandal. Training cycles have a way of dragging attention forward whether anyone feels ready or not. New objectives, new field problems, new evaluations. Time does what time does. It folds dramatic periods into the ongoing life of an organization until people begin measuring them by before and after. Before the throw, after the throw, before Harlan left, after the review, before people understood what rumors could do, after they had proof. In one field exercise, Carter found herself supervising a mixed team during a night movement across uneven pine scrub after heavy rain. Visibility low, radios glitching. One Marine with a minor ankle issue trying to hide it. Another burning through confidence too fast because darkness makes some people louder. It should have been routine. It became something else when one of the younger corporals froze on route confirmation after a NAV discrepancy and started apologizing in that panic spiral people enter when they believe one mistake has become identity. A year earlier, in a different climate, someone might have sharpened the moment into humiliation. Carter didn't. She crouched beside him, shielded the map light, and said, "Breathe. Error is information. Panic is waste. Which one are you carrying right now?" He swallowed. "Panic, Sergeant. Drop it. Keep the information." Just like that. Simple. Functional. He recalibrated. They corrected course. The team moved. Later, that corporal would say the line stayed with him far longer than the land NAV issue itself. Error is information. Panic is waste. That was Carter's influence in its purest form. Not a grand ideology. Better habits under pressure. This is why admiration for competence lasts. Sympathy fades. Inspiration gets merchandised. Competence changes the operating environment. At a regional training conference later that year, Carter was asked, informally, then formally, if she would consider instructing on small unit culture and corrective leadership. She almost laughed at the absurdity, not because she lacked the ability, because she knew exactly how institutions polish recent pain into curriculum once they decide it is safe to examine. Still, after thinking about it, she agreed once. One session, no dramatics, no personal memoir framing. She stood in front of a room of NCOs and SNCOs and did not tell the full story. She didn't need to. Instead, she talked about what public correction does to learning if misused, about the difference between standards enforcement and identity assignment, about how repeated joking establishes social permission that junior Marines treat as guidance even when leadership pretends otherwise, about why documentation matters when patterns feel too small individually to justify alarm. Some of the NCOs took notes immediately. Some crossed their arms. Some looked annoyed in the way defensive men always look when clear language threatens a behavior they prefer to keep blurry. Then she said the line that silenced all of them. If your Marines can predict who will be the punchline before you open your mouth, you are not building cohesion. You are building a caste system. No one forgot that one either. Afterward, a gunnery sergeant from another battalion approached and admitted quietly, "I think I've let that happen." Carter nodded. Then stop. Not because change is easy, because the first step is usually less mysterious than people pretend. Callahan, for his part, remained in the Corps, though not untouched. His evaluations bore the institutional scar of lost trust. He was not ruined theatrically. No universe had arranged itself into a neat morality play where one mistake erased an entire career. Real life is less satisfying and more useful than that. He had to continue serving with the knowledge of what he had helped do, and in some ways that was the harsher consequence. Because now every leadership moment asked him a question. Will you default to theater again? Or have you actually learned? Some people expected him to self-destruct. He didn't. Some expected him to rehabilitate himself overnight into a model of enlightened leadership. He didn't do that either. The change was slower, rougher, more believable. He interrupted gossip once and felt stupid doing it. Did again anyway. He corrected a younger NCO for mocking a quiet Marine during drill and heard his old voice inside the correction, then forced himself to continue. He started verifying before amplifying, started asking who benefits from a story before passing along. None of that absolved him. It did something more modest. It prevented repetition. Sometimes that is the most honest form of repentance available. Years later, if anyone ever told the story responsibly, they included that too, not to rescue his image, but to preserve moral accuracy. People are not useful when flattened into symbols. The point is not that a bad man got punished and a good woman triumphed. The point is that a command climate exposed who everyone was becoming, and then forced some of them to decide whether they would keep becoming it. That decision still belonged to Callahan after the scandal, as it belonged to every Marine who had laughed, as it belongs to every audience that mistakes consensus for truth. One summer evening, while after the case had settled into history and Carter had moved on to another assignment, she got a message from Ruiz. Not formal, just a photo first. A group of junior Marines in a classroom. Ruiz at the front now, chevrons on, dry erase marker in hand, mid-explanation over some simple training diagram. Under the photo, she had written one sentence. "I heard myself saying your words before I realized they were yours." Carter stared at the message for a while. That finally felt like legacy. Not the scandal, not the throw. Transmission, the useful kind. A way of handling pressure that survives its original battlefield and begins helping people who never saw where it came from. She replied with exactly what Ruiz expected. Make them better than the room you inherited. Nothing sentimental. Everything necessary. Because in the end, that is what this story was always about. Not revenge. Not even exposure, though exposure mattered. Inheritance. What gets passed on when harm is interrupted. What replaces the lazy culture that came before? What younger Marines learn when someone strong refuses to let contempt set the terms of belonging. The title people remembered was catchy because commands remember lines. Careful, she bites. It sounded funny in the mouths of people who did not yet understand themselves. But the line died the moment reality entered the room. And what replaced it was far more durable. A lesson with edges. That the quiet Marine may be carrying more than your loudest leaders. That public laughter can be a weapon long before it becomes evidence. That a rumor repeated by the confident does not become truer, only more expensive. That the person absorbing the pressure is not always the weakest in the formation. Sometimes they're the strongest because they're carrying what everybody else is too careless, too frightened, or too self-protective to touch. And maybe the deepest lesson of all was this. Competence is not just the ability to win when the moment turns visible. It is the ability to preserve truth long enough for visibility to matter. That is what Carter did. On the mat, yes. But much more importantly before the mat, when no one was clapping, No one was impressed, and no one except a frightened younger Marine had any idea how much was being held in place by one sergeant's discipline. 340 Marines witnessed the throw. Only a handful ever fully understood the restraint that made it meaningful. But even those who understood only part of it carried away something useful. A hesitation before laughing too fast. A second thought before trusting the room. A better instinct for who seems difficult and who might just be refusing to bend in ways the climate finds convenient. And that is enough, sometimes, to change what happens next time. Because there is always a next time. Another unit. Another joke. Another young Marine trying to decide whether what feels wrong will sound foolish once spoken aloud. Another loud leader mistaking performance for moral authority. Another room waiting to see who will set the temperature. In those moments, stories like this are not entertainment. They are warning. They are calibration. They are memory doing future work. Which is why that afternoon never really ended when the bay emptied. It kept unfolding in the habits that followed. In the corrections people made sooner. In the rumors some Marines stopped mid-sentence. In the way a few future leaders learned to look twice before deciding who in the room was fragile. And somewhere in some later training bay, under some other set of fluorescent lights, a sergeant nobody fully understood yet would step onto a mat or into an argument or under a pressure the room had already judged for her. And because this story had survived, maybe one Marine in the crowd would hold back the laugh. Maybe two. Maybe enough. That is how institutions get better. Not by pretending they were never capable of failure. By remembering exactly how failure sounded when it was still being called a joke. And by honoring, with more than applause, the people who refuse to let that joke become someone else's future. So no, what those 340 Marines never forgot was not just the throw. It was the revelation buried inside it. That Emily Carter had never been the danger they were warned about. She was the warning they should have listened to. And when the room finally understood the difference, the sound that stayed with them was not laughter anymore. It was the hard, undeniable silence of a lie hitting the ground before everyone who helped it stand. He came in a dust-coated truck with a dented front panel and a thermos that looked older than at least half the soldiers on base. The gate guards recognized him now. Word had traveled. Some saluted. Some simply stood straighter. Legends, Emily had learned, were harder to stop once truth had fed them. He found her on the west observation pad, just above the range where the air cooled first after sunset. The mountains beyond Raven Ridge had gone violet at the edges, and the valley below held the last heat of the day like a secret it had not yet decided to release. "You look tired," he said by way of greeting. "You drove 6 hours to insult me." Closer to 7. Traffic near the highway was full of idiots. She took the thermos when he held it out. Coffee, strong enough to deserve respect. They stood side by side at the rail. Below them, students from the afternoon block were still cleaning equipment under Sanchez's supervision. Voss was correcting a log sheet with visible irritation and, Emily suspected, hidden satisfaction. Delacroix watched the scene with unreadable calm. "They listen to you." "Some do. The useful ones always start there." Emily glanced at him. "That your version of praise?" "It's the highest grade I give." She drank the coffee anyway. For a while they said nothing. The range carried familiar sounds upward. A bolt cycling. A distant laugh. The slap of a target backing in the breeze. Peace did not arrive as silence. Peace arrived as ordinary noise that no longer had danger folded inside it. Delacroix tapped the notebook in her pocket with one finger. "Still carrying my bad handwriting. You wrote one good line." He grunted. "I wrote many good lines. You just only remember the useful ones." That made her smile, briefly. He saw it without turning his head. "Reynolds told me about the billet." "Yes." "You taking it?" "Yes." "Good." He let another few breaths pass before speaking again. "I should have come back sooner after Ash Lantern," he said. "I knew Briggs was smoothing the story too fast. Knew the wreckage was being filed instead of faced. I told myself preserving the evidence was enough. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't." Emily looked down at the notebook tape peeling at one corner. "You gave me something to keep." That wasn't the question. No, it wasn't. She thought of the years after Ash Lantern. The inventory forms. The quiet mockery. The sensation of being alive in a file that had been sealed before anyone read it honestly. She thought of Rourke, too, of how grievance had opened in him and never been cleaned, only weaponized. "You left the door unlocked," she said. Delacroix frowned. "What door?" "The one back." He turned then, studying her profile, maybe checking whether she meant it or was offering an easier absolution than truth deserved. Finally he nodded. "That'll do." Darkness settled by degrees. A pair of trainees crossed the lower lot carrying steel targets between them, talking too loudly, young enough to believe strength and volume were cousins. Sanchez barked something down at them, and both immediately quieted. Delacroix watched that and almost smiled. Almost. Then he reached into his jacket and handed her a folded sheet of paper. "What's this?" "My final note for the next course packet." Emily opened it. The writing was his. Sparse. Direct. "Teach them that precision without conscience is just a cleaner form of panic." She read it twice. "You want this in the curriculum? I want it where the right student will trip over it." She folded the page carefully and put it inside the notebook. When she looked up again, Delacroix was gazing out toward the ridgeline beyond the West Range, the same direction she often found herself looking when she did not mean to. Maybe he was seeing younger versions of them all. Maybe he was seeing nothing at all. With men like him, the difference was rarely visible. Rourke would have been extraordinary if he'd learned to live with disappointment, he said quietly. Emily did not answer immediately. "No," she said at last. "He would have been dangerous in better clothes." Delacroix let out one dry laugh. "Fair." They left the observation pad after sunset. 3 weeks later, the first advanced mentorship cycle began under Emily's direct lead. 12 shooters. Mixed backgrounds. 2 with obvious talent. 4 with discipline. 1 with both, which worried her more than the others. The dangerous students were never the least capable. They were the ones capable enough to trust themselves too early. She changed the course in small ways. More wind reading without firing. Longer observation blocks. More target discrimination under fatigue. More scenarios where the correct choice was to hold fire. Some complained. She let them. Complaints were just noise looking for a wall. On the 4th day, she took the class to an older high-perch position above the eastern cut, where Raven Ridge looked smaller and more human for distance. The morning was cool. The rocks still held the night in it. Diesel drifted faintly from the motor pool below, mixing with dust, and coffee from the thermos Sanchez insisted on bringing everywhere like a personal religion. She set the students on glass instead of rifles. "Today," she said, "nobody shoots." A corporal frowned. "Then what are we qualifying?" "Judgment." That answer irritated exactly the student she expected it to. Good. They watched the base wake up by increments. Supply truck at 0612. Fuel cart at 0619. 2 maintenance technicians arguing by the mast. A lieutenant jogging late and pretending not to be late. One student snorted at that. Emily ignored it. Then, a little after sunrise, movement caught her eye along the far service road. Not hostile, not dramatic. Just a man in civilian work clothes parked short of the perimeter and unloading survey equipment alone. One of the trainees spotted him a few seconds later. "Unauthorized?" he asked. Emily did not answer. Another student checked the board through binoculars. No maintenance notice. A third shifted impatiently. "Want me to radio it?" Emily kept watching the man set his tripod. "Wait." They did. 30 seconds later, a marked engineering truck appeared from behind the fuel shed, and 2 bay surveyors crossed to meet the man with paperwork in hand. Routine. Verified. Harmless. Emily lowered her glass. And maybe that was the final humiliation for the men who built their authority out of easy reactions. Not that they were exposed. Not even that they were believed capable of something smaller than the image they had made for themselves. It was that the person they had chosen as the safest target turned out to be the one person in the room operating from principle when everyone else was operating from momentum. That distinction has a long life. Because momentum is cheap. Momentum is how crowds laugh before they think. How leaders repeat a line because it lands. How rumors get passed like issued gear. No one checking the weight of what they are carrying because everybody around them is already carrying the same thing. Principle is slower, lonelier, Principal writes things down at midnight. Principal keeps its voice level when every nerve in the body wants to answer humiliation with humiliation. Principal understands that timing matters, that truth delivered too early into the wrong climate can be crushed, and truth delivered too late may still win, but only after unnecessary damage. Emily Carter understood timing better than anyone around her. That was why the story endured. Not because she was fearless. Fearless people are often reckless, and reckless people do not preserve anyone for long. Carter knew fear intimately. She knew what it felt like to enter a room and sense the temperature drop by 1 degree because someone had already spoken about you before you arrived. She knew what it felt like to hear your own name followed by silence and understand that silence was crowded with unfinished sentences. She knew the physical cost of holding anger inside a disciplined frame, how the jaw tightens, how sleep gets shallow, how the body starts preparing for contact even in quiet places. But she also knew something else. That fear can be governed. That pain can be organized. That dignity, when protected correctly, becomes a weapon stronger than noise. It showed itself months after the scandal, in a smaller moment nobody would ever put in a report. A new female private, barely out of the schoolhouse, got cornered verbally after making a simple supply error. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, just a young Marine getting pressured by 3 louder personalities at once until her face went blank and that awful look appeared in her eyes. The look of someone shrinking inward so fast they might disappear while still standing up. Carter crossed the room in 6 steps. "Enough," she said. Not loud. Didn't need to be. The air changed immediately. She did not humiliate the Marines who were crowding the private. That would have reproduced the same poison in a different direction. She separated fact from theater with the speed of someone who had spent a long time studying the difference. "What is the error?" One Lance Corporal answered, suddenly less confident. "Wrong count on the issue, Sergeant." "Is it corrected?" "Almost." "Then fix the count. If you need an audience, save it for talent night." A few nearby Marines looked down to hide the reaction. The private swallowed hard, fighting to stay composed. Carter turned to her last, voice neutral. "Take a breath. Then finish." That was all. 15 seconds, maybe 20. But the lesson that spread through the room had nothing to do with the supply count. It was about proportion, about how quickly cruelty reveals itself once somebody competent refuses to let it call itself instruction. The private would remember that moment for years. Not because she had been rescued, because she had been stabilized without being made smaller, because someone in authority had intervened without needing her humiliation as proof of leadership. That kind of memory reshapes a person's understanding of power. And that was Carter's deeper legacy. She changed what younger Marines believed authority could sound like. Not soft, not permissive, clean. There's a difference. The Corps, like any large institution, contains 2 kinds of strength and is not always wise enough to tell them apart in real time. One kind is visible, performative, dramatic. It fills space quickly. It gets mistaken for command presence because it arrives with certainty and volume. The other kind is harder to market. It is patient. It observes. It notices patterns before other people notice outcomes. It knows how to act without needing the room to admire the action while it's happening. The first kind is easier to reward. The second kind is easier to survive. That was the true contrast between Callahan and Carter. Not man and woman. Not bigger and smaller. Not even aggressor and defender, though those roles mattered. It was performance versus structure. He relied on atmosphere. She built position. He assumed the crowd, made him safe. She understood that if you control yourself long enough, the crowd eventually becomes irrelevant. That is why the throw felt so absolute. It did not just reverse leverage. It reversed meaning. All at once, every previous laugh had to be reinterpreted. Every careless repetition had to be dragged back through conscience. Every Marine who had told himself it was harmless was forced to ask why harmless things always seemed to land on the same person, in the same direction, to the same institutional effect. Most people do not enjoy that kind of self-examination. They prefer clearer villains, simpler morals, shorter stories. But long after the formal findings were filed away, the battalion's older Marines understood that the real damage had never come from one monstrous act in isolation. It had come from the thousand moments where decent people accepted a crooked frame because doing so cost them nothing in the moment. That was the warning, because institutions rarely collapse all at once. They bend in increments. A joke here, a favorite there, a rumor treated as useful shorthand, a quiet Marine reframed as unstable because her silence is inconvenient to men who need everything legible on their terms. That is how the ground shifts before anybody admits the building is moving. Carter had felt that movement earlier than most, and because she felt it, she adjusted her footing while others kept strolling toward it like it was still solid ground. Later, after she left that command, a young officer who had once watched the whole affair from too far up the chain and too far away from reality tried to summarize her in one sentence over coffee with another leader. That, she said, is why most bad decisions start with good intentions and poor patience. The students were still looking downrange. One asked, "How long did you know it was clean?" "I didn't." That made them turn back to her. She let the silence do its work. Then she added, "I knew I didn't know." The wind touched the ridgeline. The base below moved on in ordinary patterns. Somewhere a steel door slammed at the end of a hallway and echoed out into the morning. It sounded nothing like Kestrel Basin. It sounded better. Emily lifted the notebook once, not opening it, just feeling the weight of all that had survived inside so little paper. The next class would come, then another. Files would never stop trying to replace people. Ambitious men would never stop mistaking control for wisdom. Somewhere out beyond the range and the mountains and the clean morning air, new lies were already being typed into neat language. But up on that ridge, for one quiet moment before instruction resumed, the future still looked reachable. Emily settled the binoculars back to her eyes and spoke without raising her voice. "Watch longer," she said. "The truth is usually still arriving." "She was tough," he said. The other officer, older and wiser, shook his head. "No," he replied. "She was disciplined. Tough people crack all the time. Discipline is what kept her from cracking where it would have cost someone else." That was closer, still not complete, because there was one more thing people missed when they tried to explain her. Mercy, not softness. Mercy, the deliberate choice not to do maximum damage when maximum damage is available. She could have embarrassed Callahan more on that mat. Anyone with her control could see the openings after the first throw. She could have made him look foolish in a way no room would ever let him live down cleanly. She didn't. She made the point, restored order, and stopped exactly where professionalism required. She could have turned her later influence into a campaign of social vengeance against everyone who laughed. She didn't. She corrected what needed correction and let the rest remain with the people who had to live inside their own memory. That restraint was not weakness either. It was force with boundaries. And force with boundaries is one of the rarest things any institution ever produces reliably. Maybe that was why the image stayed so sharp for the Marines who saw it. Not just a man falling, a woman deciding precisely how far he needed to fall for the truth to stand up. That is the kind of judgment you cannot fake. You either have it before the moment comes, or you don't. By the time years had passed and the story settled into unit lore, the details were no longer what carried the weight. People forgot exact dates, mixed up ranks, misremembered who stood where in the bay. That always happens. Memory sands down specifics and preserves essence. The essence was this. A lie had been fed for so long it started walking like fact. Then one afternoon, under fluorescent light and in front of 340 Marines, reality hit the mat hard enough for everyone to hear. And once they heard it, they could never go back to claiming they did not know what that sound meant. So when the story gets told now, by the few who understand it well enough to tell it right, they do not linger on the joke. They do not even linger on the throw. They linger on the silence after. On the terrible, clarifying silence that falls when a crowd realizes it has mistaken discipline for fragility, composure for consent, and rumor for truth. Because that silence was not empty. It was full of recognition, full of shame, full of recalculation, full of the sudden understanding that the smallest person in the room had been carrying the heaviest load with the steadiest hands. And if there is any line worth remembering from all of it, it is not the one they used to mock her. It is the one the room learned too late. That the most dangerous thing in any command is not the Marine who knows how to throw a louder man to the mat. It is the culture that teaches good people to laugh before they look. Emily Carter broke that culture for one unforgettable afternoon. And because she did, a lot of people finally saw each other clearly. Some for the first time, some for the last. And the echo that remained was not violence. It was correction. Cold, clean, undeniable correction. The kind that does not ask for applause. The kind that does not apologize for arriving. The kind that waits, watches, takes the full measure of the room, and then, in one exact movement, leaves the lie flat on its back for everyone to answer to.